The ballroom smelled of amber and desperation, a heady mix of expensive perfume trying to mask the sharp tang of anxiety that clung to every unmated wolf in the room. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across polished marble floors, creating shadows that seemed to pulse with the same nervous energy thrumming through my veins. I stood against the far wall, my pale blonde hair pulled back in a simple braid that felt increasingly inadequate as I watched she-wolves parade past in elaborate updos, adorned with jewels that caught the light like tiny stars. The annual gathering wasn't just a social event, it was a marketplace, a ritual where unmated wolves from packs across the northern territories came to find their other half, or at least make advantageous connections. My father had insisted I attend, his weathered hands gripping my shoulders that morning with a desperation that made my chest ache. "You're 23, Celia," he'd said, his voice rough with worry. "The pack needs this." We need this. What he meant was that our small pack, tucked away in the forgotten corners of the Pinewood territory, needed alliances, needed relevance, needed me to be something I'd never quite managed to be notable. I pressed my back harder against the cool wall, watching as Dominic Ashford, the Alpha King himself, moved through the crowd like a storm-given human form. He was everything the stories claimed and more. Tall enough that most wolves had to tilt their heads back to meet his eyes, with dark hair that looked perpetually disheveled, as if he'd just run his hands through it in frustration. But it was his presence that truly unsettled me. Power radiated from him in waves that made my wolf whimper and press low in my mind, caught between the instinct to submit and an inexplicable urge to step closer. He was interviewing she-wolves. That's what my friend Sarah had whispered to me an hour ago, her eyes wide with scandalous delight. The Alpha King, 28 and still unmated, was actually speaking to potential matches. The revelation had sent the entire gathering into barely concealed chaos. Celia Thorne. I jerked at the sound of my name, my head snapping toward Counselor Brennan, a stern-faced man with silver threading through his dark hair. He stood with a small group of pack officials, and they were all looking at me with expressions ranging from pity to calculation. "The Alpha King has requested you join the receiving line," Brennan said, his tone making it clear this wasn't actually a request. My heart stuttered. "I think there's been a mistake." "No mistake." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Come along." The walk across that ballroom felt endless. Eyes tracked my movement, and I heard the whispers start immediately. Who was I? What pack? Surely not that Celia Thorne from Pinewood. The one whose mother had died bringing her into the world, leaving her father to raise a daughter who'd grown up more comfortable with books than pack politics. The receiving line was composed of 7 she-wolves, each one stunning in their own right. They stood with practiced grace, shoulders back, chins lifted just enough to show confidence without arrogance. I took my place at the end, trying to emulate their posture, and feeling like a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. Dominic worked his way down the line methodically. I couldn't hear what he asked each woman, but I watched their responses. The flirtatious laughs, the demure smiles, the practiced humility that somehow still managed to showcase their best attributes. He spent no more than 2 minutes with each before moving on, his expression growing progressively darker. Then he was in front of me. Up close, Dominic Ashford was devastating in a way that had nothing to do with conventional attractiveness, and everything to do with the barely leashed danger that seemed to simmer just beneath his skin. His eyes were a peculiar shade of amber that seemed to glow in the chandelier light, and when they locked onto mine, I felt the impact like a physical touch. "Name," he said, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Celia Thorne, Your Majesty." My voice came out steadier than I'd expected. "Small miracle, Pinewood Pack." It wasn't a question. "Small territory, eastern border, your father is Gregory Thorne." "Yes, Your Majesty." Something flickered across his face. Interest, maybe, or irritation. It was gone too quickly to interpret. "You're very young." 23. I paused, then added with a hint of defiance I couldn't quite suppress, "The same age your mother was when she became queen." The silence that fell was absolute. I felt every eye in the vicinity snap to us, felt the collective intake of breath as the crowd waited to see if I'd just committed social suicide. Even my wolf went completely still, equally parts horrified and oddly proud of my boldness. Dominic's eyes narrowed, but instead of the anger I expected, the corner of his mouth twitched. "Studied your royal history, have you?" "I studied all history, Your Majesty." It seemed important to understand where we came from if we want to know where we're going. "A philosopher." He tilted his head, studying me with an intensity that made my skin feel too tight. "Tell me, Miss Thorne, do you have a boyfriend?" The question was so unexpected, so utterly casual compared to the formal tone of our conversation, that I almost laughed. Around us, I could hear the whispers surge like wind through dry leaves. This was new territory. He hadn't asked any of the others something so personal. "Not yet, Your Majesty." I meant it as a simple statement of fact. I was young, focused on helping my father manage our struggling pack, and frankly, most of the males in Pinewood treated me like Gregory's peculiar daughter, who read too much and smiled too little. But the moment the words left my mouth, I realized how they could be interpreted. Not yet. As if I was expecting someone, as if I had prospects waiting in the wings. The change in Dominic was instantaneous and terrifying. His entire body went rigid. Muscles tensing beneath the formal black suit that probably cost more than my father's house. The amber of his eyes seemed to darken, swirling with something primal and possessive that made my breath catch. The air around us thickened, charged with an energy that raised every hair on my body. Not yet, he repeated, his voice dropping to a register that bypassed my brain entirely and went straight to some ancient instinctive part of me that recognized a predator when it heard one. Meaning you're considering someone. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. I know that's not. I stumbled over the words, suddenly very aware of how close he'd moved. He hadn't actually stepped toward me, but his presence had expanded somehow, enveloping me in a way that made the ballroom, the crowd, everything else fade into insignificance. I simply meant I'm not currently involved with anyone. But you expect to be, I suppose, eventually. Isn't that what this whole gathering is about? Wrong answer. Absolutely. Catastrophically wrong answer. Dominic's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking beneath his skin. Around us, the crowd had gone from curious to transfixed, watching this exchange like spectators at a sporting event. I could see Counselor Brennan looking increasingly concerned, as if he was debating whether to intervene. Who is he? Dominic asked. And this time there was no mistaking the command in his voice. This wasn't the charming alpha king making polite conversation. This was a predator demanding answers. There's no one, don't lie to me. He leaned in, close enough that I could smell cedar and winter storms, close enough that his breath stirred the loose strands of hair that had escaped my braid. Your heart is racing, you're nervous. That suggests guilt. I'm nervous because you're terrifying me. I shot back, some reckless part of me breaking free of the fear. And I'm not lying. There is no boyfriend, no prospects, no secret male waiting in the wings. I'm the strange girl from a failing pack who spends more time in the archives than at pack functions. Trust me, Your Majesty. I'm not exactly fighting off suitors. The confession tumbled out with more bitterness than I'd intended, exposing truths I usually kept carefully locked away. I saw something shift in Dominic's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or something that looked almost like recognition. He straightened slowly, and the oppressive weight of his anger eased fractionally. But his eyes never left mine, and there was something burning in their depths that I couldn't name. Something hungry and wounded and dangerous all at once. You'll sit at my table for dinner, he said abruptly, directly to my right, before I could respond, before I could even process what that meant. He turned and strode away, leaving a wake of stunned silence and frantic whispers behind him. Sarah materialized at my elbow within seconds, her fingers digging into my arm with barely contained excitement. Celia, do you have any idea what just happened? He claimed you in front of everyone. The seat to his right, that's the position of honor, reserved for. I know what it's reserved for. I interrupted, my voice faint. My legs felt suddenly unsteady, and I gripped Sarah's arm in return, needing the anchor. This is a mistake. He's made some kind of mistake. But even as I said it, I could still feel the weight of his gaze, still smell cedar and storms, still hear that possessive growl underlying his words. Do you have a boyfriend? And I realized with a clarity that was almost frightening that whatever had just happened, whatever I'd somehow triggered in the Alpha King with my thoughtless response, had set something irrevocable into motion. The real question was whether I'd survive what came next. The dinner was a nightmare, dressed in fine china and political maneuvering. I sat rigidly in the chair to Dominic's right, acutely aware of every eye in the dining hall fixed on me with varying degrees of curiosity, envy, and calculation. The long table stretched before us, laden with dishes I barely recognized. Roasted meats glistening with herbs I couldn't name, vegetables arranged in artistic spirals, wines that probably cost more than my father's monthly income. My stomach churned too violently to consider eating any of it. Dominic had been silent since we'd taken our seats, his attention apparently focused on the conversations happening around him. But I could feel his awareness of me like heat against my skin. Every time I shifted in my chair, every time I reached for my water glass with trembling fingers, I sensed his attention sharpen, felt those amber eyes track my movements even when his head didn't turn. You're not eating, he said suddenly, his voice low enough that only I could hear beneath the din of conversation. I'm not hungry, Your Majesty. Dominic. He cut a piece of meat with precise movements, still not looking at me directly. When we're speaking privately, you'll call me Dominic. The presumption that we'd be speaking privately again sent a flutter through my chest that I firmly ignored. That would be inappropriate. So would be half the thoughts I've had since you said, not yet. In that tone that suggested you were hiding something. Now he did turn to face me, and the intensity in his gaze made me forget how to breathe. So I think we're well past worrying about propriety, don't you? Heat snorts flooded my face. I wasn't hiding anything. I told you. You told me what you thought I wanted to hear. He leaned closer, and I caught that scent again. Cedar and winter storms and something wild that called to a part of me I'd never fully acknowledged. But your scent changed when you said it. Got sharper, more complex. I don't know what you were embarrassed, he continued as if I hadn't spoken. Not guilty, not deceitful, embarrassed because you were admitting to being alone. The accuracy of his observation left me speechless. Around us, the dinner continued. Pack leaders discussing territory disputes, she-wolves laughing at jokes I couldn't hear, the clink of silverware against porcelain creating a rhythm that should have been soothing but only amplified my anxiety. Why does it matter? I finally asked, forcing myself to meet his eyes even though every instinct screamed at me to look away, to submit, to make myself smaller. Why do you care whether I have a boyfriend or prospects or anything else? Something flickered across his face, an emotion too quick to catch, but intense enough that it changed the air between us. I don't know, he admitted, and the raw honesty in those 3 words stunned me more than anything else he could have said. But I do. And it's making me behave like a territorial bastard over a woman I met less than 2 hours ago, before I could formulate a response to that earth-shattering confession. Counselor Brennan rose from his seat further down the table, tapping his glass to call for attention. The conversations died down gradually, all eyes turning toward the counselor's stern face. Your Majesty, Brennan began, his tone formal and practiced. If I may, I believe there are several matters of pack business that require your attention before the evening concludes. The Morrison pack has requested an audience regarding the border dispute with Tomorrow. Dominic cut him off, his voice carrying effortlessly across the suddenly silent room. Whatever it is can wait until tomorrow. Brennan's jaw tightened. Your Majesty, with respect, these matters have been pending for weeks. The other alphas are growing. I said tomorrow, Brennan. There was steel in Dominic's voice now, the kind of absolute authority that made it clear this wasn't a discussion. Tonight, I'm otherwise occupied. The counselor's gaze flicked to me, and I saw calculation in his eyes that made my skin crawl. Of course, Your Majesty, as you wish. The conversations resumed slowly, but the atmosphere had shifted. I could feel the speculation, the questions, the assumptions being made about what exactly the Alpha King was occupied with. My face burned with humiliation and something else, something that felt dangerously like anticipation. You didn't have to do that, I murmured to Dominic once the attention had mercifully shifted away from us. Now everyone thinks, let them think. He finally began eating, the movements casual in a way that felt deliberately calculated to appear unbothered. They'll think what they want, regardless of what we do or don't do. Might as well give them something interesting to speculate about. Easy for you to say, you're the Alpha King. I'm nobody from nowhere, and tomorrow I'll go back to being exactly that while you were going back. The words hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I couldn't begin to process. Excuse me? Dominic set down his fork, turning to face me fully. In the candlelight, his features seemed carved from stone, beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way that made him look more like a warrior from ancient legends than a modern king. You heard me, Celia. You're not going back to Pinewood, not tomorrow, not for a while. Panic flared hot in my chest. You can't just, that's not, I have responsibilities. My father will be informed that you're staying as a guest of the royal court. His tone brooked no argument. Consider it an honor, a chance for your pack to strengthen its ties with the crown. Consider it a prison, I shot back, anger overriding fear. You can't kidnap me just because I said something that triggered your whatever this is. Jealousy. The word came out flat, matter of fact. The word you're looking for is jealousy, and you're right. It's irrational, possessive, and completely inappropriate given that we're strangers, but there it is. The honesty was like a slap. I stared at him, searching for some sign that he was joking or testing me, but his expression remained serious, almost grim, as if he was as confused and frustrated by his own behavior as I was. Why? I whispered. If I knew that, I wouldn't be sitting here making decrees I'll probably regret tomorrow. He reached for his wine glass, took a long drink. But something about you, the way you stood there against that wall trying to disappear, the way you looked at me like you were seeing something other people miss, the defiance when you mentioned my mother, it got under my skin. And then that not yet, and I just snapped. The vulnerability in his admission did something dangerous to my resolve. This wasn't the performance of a king playing political games. This was a man genuinely unsettled by his own reactions, trying to make sense of something that defied logic. I can't stay, I said, but my voice had lost its certainty. My father needs me. The pack will manage for a few weeks. Dominic's hand moved, resting on the table between us, not touching me, but close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. I'm not asking you to abandon them. I'm asking you to give me time to figure out what the hell this is before you disappear back to a pack on the edge of nowhere, and I spend the rest of my life wondering. The words hung between us, raw and honest in a way that felt almost painful. Around us, dinner continued. Pack leaders making alliances, she-wolves positioning themselves for advantage, the endless political dance that was apparently the reality of life at this level. But in our small bubble, it felt like the rest of the world had faded away. And if I refuse, I asked, though I already knew the answer. Then you refuse and I let you go, and I spend the next several years being an even bigger bastard than usual, because I'll be haunted by what might have been. He finally looked away, jaw clenched. I won't force you, Celia. Despite what you might think, I'm not actually in the habit of kidnapping women who intrigue me. But I am asking, genuinely asking, for a chance to understand this before it's gone. I should have said no. Every logical part of my brain screamed at me to refuse, to run back to the safety of Pinewood, and forget this night ever happened. The Alpha King was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical power, and everything to do with the way he seemed to see straight through every defense I'd carefully constructed. But there was something in his voice, a loneliness that mirrored my own, a confusion that suggested he was just as lost in this strange pull between us as I was. And beneath my fear, beneath my logical objections, something wild and reckless whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the kind of chance that came once in a lifetime. 2 weeks, I heard myself say, and watched his shoulders release tension I hadn't realized he was carrying. I'll stay for 2 weeks, but if at the end of that time this whatever this is hasn't made any more sense, I go home. No arguments, no decrees, no royal pressure. Dominic's smile was small but genuine, transforming his harsh features into something almost boyish. Deal. 2 weeks for us both to figure out why a simple question about boyfriends made me want to tear apart every male who might have looked at you twice. The possessiveness in his words should have terrified me. Instead, it sent a thrill down my spine that I absolutely refused to examine too closely. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of stolen glances and careful conversation. Dominic introduced me to several pack leaders, his hand occasionally ghosting across the small of my back in gestures that appeared casual, but felt anything but. Each touch left trails of heat that lingered long after his hand moved away, and I found myself hyper-aware of every shift of his body, every breath, every time those amber eyes found mine across the table. By the time the dinner ended and guests began filtering toward the ballroom for dancing, my nerves were wound so tight I thought I might shatter. Sarah caught my eye from across the room, her expression torn between excitement for me and concern at the intensity of whatever was unfolding. "Walk with me," Dominic said quietly as the crowd thinned. "I'll show you to your quarters." It wasn't a request, but it wasn't quite a command either. I nodded, allowing him to guide me through corridors that grew progressively quieter as we left the main gathering spaces behind. The palace was enormous, all stone and tapestries and history that pressed down from every wall. I tried to memorize the turns, the landmarks, anything that might help me navigate this place I'd apparently agreed to call home for the next 2 weeks. We climbed a wide staircase, and I became aware that we were utterly alone. No guards, no servants, no witnesses to whatever might happen in the shadows of this ancient place. My heart hammered against my ribs, caught between exhilaration and terror. "This wing is reserved for high-ranking guests and royal family," Dominic explained as we walked down another corridor, this one lined with doors carved from dark wood. "You'll have privacy here, safety." Safety from what? He stopped walking, turning to face me with an expression that made something in my chest constrict. "From the wolves who will see you as a threat, from those who will try to use your sudden elevation to their advantage, from court politics that can devour someone unprepared in a matter of days." He paused, then added softly, "And from me when you need it." The confession hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. "What if I don't want safety from you?" The words escaped before I could stop them, Clear's throat bold and reckless and completely honest. Dominic's eyes darkened, and for a moment I thought he might close the distance between us. Instead, he took a deliberate step back, putting space between us that felt like a physical wound. "Then you're more dangerous than I thought," he said, his voice rough. "And I'm in far more trouble than I realized." He turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the corridor with my heart racing and the certainty that I'd just agreed to something that would change everything. The first 3 days passed in a strange blur of routine and chaos. Mornings began with Alina, a middle-aged she-wolf assigned as my attendant, arriving with breakfast and clothes far more elegant than anything I'd owned in Pinewood. She spoke little, but her efficiency was comforting, a steady presence in a world that felt increasingly unstable. I'd eat while watching the sun rise over the palace grounds, trying to reconcile the girl I'd been with whoever I was becoming. Dominic was everywhere and nowhere. I'd catch glimpses of him in corridors, surrounded by advisors and pack leaders, his expression carved from ice as he handled the endless demands of ruling. Sometimes our eyes would meet across courtyards or through doorways, and the intensity in his gaze would stop my breath. But he never approached, never sought me out, as if that moment outside my door, that confession about danger and trouble, had scared him into retreat. It was driving me slowly insane. On the fourth morning, I woke to voices outside my door. Not Alina's gentle knock, but harsh masculine tones that carried the unmistakable edge of argument. Absolutely unacceptable. The Alpha King cannot simply install some nobody in the royal wing without "watch your tongue, counselor." That was a voice I'd come to recognize. Jackson, one of Dominic's personal guards, steady, unflappable, and fiercely loyal. She's here by the king's decree. That makes her very much somebody. She's a distraction. Brennan shot back. He's missed 3 council meetings, postponed audiences with visiting alphas, and yesterday, he nearly took Morrison's head off for asking a simple question about territory lines, all because he's obsessing over a girl from a pack so small it barely registers on our maps. The words hit like physical blows. I pressed closer to the door, my wolf stirring restlessly at the contempt in Brennan's voice. Perhaps that says more about what he sees in her than what she is. Jackson replied coolly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have my duties. Your duty is to the crown, not to enabling our king's latest infatuation. Brennan's voice dropped, took on a darker tone. She'll leave in a week and a half. They all do. And when she goes, he'll be left dealing with the consequences of neglected responsibilities and damaged relationships with packs who felt insulted by being dismissed in favor of spending time with a nobody. The door handle turned before I could step back. I found myself face to face with Brennan's stern expression, Jackson's concerned gaze just behind him. Both men froze, clearly not expecting to find me awake and within earshot. "Miss Thorne," Brennan said, recovering quickly. His smile was practiced, empty. "I trust you're finding your accommodation satisfactory." "Perfectly satisfactory, thank you." I kept my voice level, refused to let him see how his words had cut. "Though I'm curious, if you have concerns about my presence, wouldn't it be more appropriate to bring them to the king directly, rather than discussing them in hallways?" Something flashed in Brennan's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or respect. "Indeed, my apologies if we disturbed you, if you'll excuse me." He swept past, leaving me alone with Jackson, who looked torn between amusement and concern. "He's not wrong, is he?" I asked quietly, "about me being a distraction." Jackson studied me for a long moment, then smiled slightly. "The king hasn't been himself since the gathering, but I wouldn't necessarily call it a bad thing. He's been different, more present somehow, even when he's handling business. Like he's got something worth coming back to." He paused, then added, "He asks about you, every day, what you're doing, if you're comfortable, if you've seemed unhappy." The revelation sent warmth flooding through my chest. He hasn't spoken to me in days, because he's terrified. Jackson's honesty was startling. "I've served Dominic for 6 years, and I've never seen him afraid of anything. But whatever you make him feel, that scares the hell out of him." Before I could respond, footsteps echoed down the corridor. We both turned to see Dominic himself approaching, and my heart immediately kicked into overdrive. He wore simpler clothes today, dark pants and a fitted shirt that somehow made him look more dangerous than the formal attire. And his hair was disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. "Jackson, give us a moment," Dominic said, his eyes never leaving mine. The guard nodded and disappeared with practiced discretion, leaving us alone in the corridor flooded with morning light. "I heard Brennan," Dominic said without preamble. "I was coming to find you when I caught his scent near your door." His jaw clenched. What he said was accurate. I crossed my arms, suddenly very aware that I was still in my night clothes, my pale hair loose and uncombed. "You've been avoiding me, neglecting your responsibilities, and apparently causing political damage because of whatever this is. Is that what you think?" He moved closer, and I forced myself to hold my ground, even though every instinct screamed at me to either run or close the distance between us. "That I'm neglecting responsibilities, aren't you?" "I'm restructuring priorities." He stopped just outside what would be considered appropriate distance, close enough that I see the exhaustion shadowing his eyes, and yes, that includes taking time to figure out why a woman I barely know has managed to upend everything I thought I understood about myself. Maybe that's the problem. The words came out sharper than intended. You're so busy trying to figure it out that you're not actually doing anything. We agreed to 2 weeks to see if this made sense, but we can't do that if you're hiding in council meetings and I'm locked in my room like some dirty secret. His expression darkened. "You're not a dirty secret." "Then what am I?" I challenged. "What are we doing, Dominic? Because right now it feels like we're both just waiting for an answer to appear magically while the rest of your world falls apart around us." The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken things. Then, abruptly, Dominic reached out and caught my hand. The contact sent electricity racing up my arm, and I gasped at the intensity of it. "Come with me," he said. "Where?" "Somewhere we can actually talk without counselors and politics and expectations." His grip tightened, and there was something almost desperate in his eyes. Please. I should have demanded more information, should have insisted on changing clothes, fixing my appearance, maintaining some semblance of propriety. Instead, I found myself nodding and letting him pull me down the corridor. We moved through the palace like thieves, taking servant passages and back stairways that Dominic navigated with the ease of long familiarity. I realized he'd probably used these routes as a child, escaping tutors or seeking adventure in a life that demanded perfection. We emerged into a garden I hadn't known existed, a wild space tucked behind the formal grounds where nature had been allowed to grow with minimal intervention. Ancient trees stretched overhead, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns. The sound of running water led us to a small stream that bubbled over smooth stones, and the air smelled of earth and growing things and freedom. I used to come here when I was young, Dominic said, finally releasing my hand. I immediately missed the contact. My mother would find me here when the pressure got too much. She'd sit with me and tell me that even kings needed places where they could just be themselves. I settled onto a flat rock near the stream, tucking my nightgown around my legs. Your mother sounds like she was remarkable. She was. He sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. She died when I was 16, heart failure, sudden and brutal. My father followed 2 years later. They said it was a hunting accident, but I think he just gave up. Without her, he didn't know how to be anyone. The pain in his voice was raw, unguarded in a way I suspected few people ever heard. I'm sorry. Don't be, it was a long time ago. But his hands clenched into fists against his thighs, betraying the lie. The point is, she taught me that strength and vulnerability aren't opposites, that the strongest wolves are the ones who can admit when they're lost. Are you lost? He turned to face me fully, and the expression in his amber eyes stole my breath completely. I look at you and nothing makes sense anymore. My priorities shift. My temper flares at things that never bothered me before. I find myself making decisions based on what will get me closer to you, rather than what's politically advantageous. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Brennan's right, I'm a mess because of you. I didn't ask for that, I whispered. I know, that's what makes it worse. You're just existing, being yourself, and somehow that's enough to make me question everything I thought I wanted from life. The confession hung in the air between us. I thought about all the years I'd spent invisible in Pinewood, convinced that I'd never be anything more than Gregory's strange daughter who preferred books to parties. And now, here was the most powerful wolf in the Northern Territories telling me that my mere existence had upended his world. What did you want? I asked. Before. Peace mostly. He picked up a smooth stone, turned it over in his fingers. A strong queen who understood politics and could help me navigate the endless power struggles. Someone competent and composed who wouldn't need me to be anything other than the king. He threw the stone into the stream, watched it disappear beneath the surface. Someone safe. And I'm not safe. You're the opposite of safe. He looked at me, and the hunger in his gaze made my skin flush hot. You make me want things I have no business wanting. You make me feel things I've spent years learning to suppress. And the worst part is, I don't even know if you feel anything beyond confusion and obligation. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it, the moment to be honest or retreat behind polite deflection. I thought about the past 4 days of stolen glances and careful distance. Of lying awake wondering if I'd imagined the connection that had sparked between us that first night. I think about you constantly, I admitted, the words trembling but true. I lie in that beautiful room and wonder if you're thinking about me too, or if I'm just some puzzle you're trying to solve. And then I feel guilty because I'm supposed to be helping my father and my pack, not falling for a king who could have anyone he wanted. Falling? Dominic's voice was rough, urgent. You said falling. It was a figure of don't. He shifted closer, and suddenly there was no space between us at all. His hand came up to cup my face, thumb brushing across my cheekbone with devastating gentleness. Don't take it back, please. I couldn't have taken it back if I wanted to. The truth was written in every racing heartbeat, every shortened breath, every part of me that leaned into his touch like a flower seeking sun. I'm terrified, I whispered. Me too. His forehead came to rest against mine, and the intimacy of the gesture made my eyes burn with unexpected tears. I've been running this kingdom for 10 years. I've negotiated treaties, put down rebellions, made decisions that affected thousands of lives, but I have no idea how to do this, how to be what you need. Maybe you don't have to know. My hands came up to rest against his chest, feeling his heart thunder beneath my palms. Maybe we just try together. The kiss, when it came, was nothing like I'd imagined. There was no practiced seduction, no calculated passion. Instead, it was tentative and searching, like we were both trying to communicate things we had no words for. His lips were soft against mine, questioning, and when I sighed into the contact, he made a sound low in his throat that sent heat cascading through my entire body. He broke apart slowly, breathing hard, forehead still pressed together as if separating completely might shatter something fragile and precious. 2 weeks isn't going to be enough, Dominic said, his voice wrecked. No. I agreed, my fingers curling into his shirt. It's really not. And somewhere in the trees above us, birds sang their approval, while the stream continued its endless journey, indifferent to the fact that everything had just irrevocably changed. The next week unfolded like a dream I was afraid to wake from. Dominic stopped hiding. Whatever wall he'd built between us crumbled after that morning in the garden, and suddenly he was everywhere. Walking with me through the palace grounds, sitting beside me during meals, finding excuses to seek me out between meetings. The court watched with barely concealed fascination as their reserved, controlled king transformed into someone almost unrecognizable. But it wasn't all romance and stolen kisses. The reality of his world pressed in from all sides. I attended my first council meeting on the 8th day, sitting in a chair that had been hastily added beside Dominic's at the head of the table. The room fell silent when I entered, and I felt the weight of every stare, calculating, judging, measuring my worth. "Gentlemen," Dominic said, his tone brooking no argument. "Miss Thorne will be joining us. I value her perspective." Brennan's expression could have curdled milk. "Your Majesty, with respect, council meetings involve sensitive matters of state. Perhaps Miss Thorne would be more comfortable. I'm quite comfortable where I am, Counselor," I interrupted, keeping my voice steady despite the anxiety churning in my gut. "Unless you're suggesting the Alpha King's judgment is so poor that he'd compromise security by including someone he doesn't trust." Several of the other counselors shifted uncomfortably. Dominic's hand found mine beneath the table, squeezed once in silent support. The meeting proceeded with painful formality. They discussed border disputes, resource allocations, complaints from smaller packs about being overlooked in favor of larger territories. I listened carefully, noting the undercurrents of power and resentment that flowed beneath every supposedly neutral statement. "The Pinewood Pack," Brennan said at one point, his eyes finding mine with predatory precision, "has requested additional resources for infrastructure repair. However, given their size and strategic irrelevance, I've recommended we deny the petition." Heat flooded my face, but I forced myself to remain calm. Strategic irrelevance? Pinewood borders the eastern mountains. Those peaks are the first line of defense against incursions from the wild territories. Dismissing them as irrelevant seems short-sighted. "With respect, Miss Thorne, you're hardly objective. Neither are you." I cut him off, Clear's throat leaning forward. "You've made your opinion of me very clear, Counselor. But that doesn't change the facts. Pinewood may be small, but it serves a purpose. Neglecting them weakens the entire network of border security." Silence fell. I could feel Dominic's attention on me, intense and assessing. When I finally dared to glance at him, I found something like pride glowing in his amber eyes. "Ms. Thorne makes a valid point," he said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Approve the resources for Pinewood. And Brennan, in future, try to separate your personal feelings from your professional recommendations. It's beneath you." The rebuke was subtle but unmistakable. Brennan's jaw clenched, but he nodded stiffly. I'd made an enemy, I realized. Not just an opponent, but someone who would actively work against me. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, I felt oddly calm, as if some part of me had been waiting for this fight my entire life. After the meeting, Dominic pulled me into an empty corridor, his hands framing my face with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the steel he'd shown in the council room. "You were magnificent," he said, and the raw admiration in his voice made my knees weak. I was terrified. I know, that's what made it magnificent. He kissed me, slow and deep, and I melted into him like I'd been doing this my whole life. "You didn't back down, didn't apologize for existing. You just held your ground. He's going to make my life difficult now. Let him try." Dominic's expression hardened. "He forgets that I'm the one who decides who stays and who goes, and you're staying." The certainty in his words sent a thrill through me. "Am I? If you want to." His thumb traced my lower lip and I shivered. "Our 2 weeks are almost up, but I don't want you to leave, Celia. I want you to stay. Not as a guest, not as some temporary distraction, but as is mine." The possessiveness should have rankled. Instead, it lit something wild and fierce in my chest. "Yours, if you'll have me." His voice dropped, turned vulnerable. "I know I'm not easy. I know this world is brutal and complicated, and you'll face opposition every day, but I promise you I will fight for you always. In council rooms and ballrooms and anywhere else someone tries to diminish what you are." I thought about Pinewood, about my father's gentle face and the small house that had been my entire world. I thought about the girl I'd been, invisible, overlooked, convinced she'd never be anything more than Gregory's odd daughter. And then I thought about who I'd become in these past days. Someone who could stare down counselors and stand beside a king and not feel like she was pretending. "I want to talk to my father first," I said finally. "He deserves to hear this from me, not through official channels." Dominic nodded immediately. "Of course, I'll arrange for you to travel to Pinewood tomorrow. Jackson will accompany you." "Alone?" I interrupted. "I need to do this alone." He hesitated, and I could see the war in his expression. The king who understood political necessity versus the wolf who wanted to keep me close and protected. Finally, he nodded. Alone. But you come back to me. I come back to you, I agreed, and sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted like hope and future and everything I'd never let myself want. The journey to Pinewood took most of the next day. I watched the landscape change through the carriage window from the manicured perfection of the royal territories to the wilder, rougher terrain of the borderlands. By the time we reached my father's house, twilight had painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. Gregory was in the garden tending to the vegetables that had sustained us through countless lean seasons. He straightened when he heard the carriage, his weathered face breaking into a smile that made my chest ache with love and guilt. Celia. He pulled me into a hug that smelled of earth and safety and home. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about your old him tight, memorizing the feel of his arms around me. Can we talk? We sat on the porch as darkness fell and I told him everything. About Dominic and the jealousy and the impossible connection that defied logic. About council meetings and Brennan's hostility and the choice I was facing. My father listened without interrupting, his expression growing more thoughtful as I spoke. You love him, he said finally. It wasn't a question. Clears throat, I think I do. The admission felt huge, terrifying. Is that insane? It's been less than 2 weeks. Your mother and I knew after 3 days. His smile was sad, tinged with old grief. Sometimes souls recognize each other quickly. The question isn't whether you love him. Clears throat, it's whether you're prepared for what loving him will cost. What do you mean? You'll be queen, Celia, not just his partner, but a leader. You'll face opposition from wolves who think you're not good enough, not qualified, not worthy. You'll make decisions that affect thousands of lives. You'll have enemies who will use your every mistake against you. He took my hand, squeezed gently. But if you love him, really love him, then you'll find the strength to bear it. Just like your mother did when she chose to be my mate, even though it meant leaving her own pack behind. I stared at him. Clear's throat, I never knew that she left her pack for you. She was supposed to mate with their alpha's son. Powerful match, politically advantageous. But she loved me instead. A nobody from a small territory with nothing to offer but my heart. His eyes grew distant with memory. Her family disowned her. Her pack shunned her, but she never regretted it. She told me once that choosing love over safety was the bravest thing she ever did. Tears blurred my vision. I miss her. Me too, sweetheart, every day. He pulled me close and I let myself be his little girl again, just for a moment. But I see so much of her in you. That same courage, that same fierce heart. If you love this king of yours, if he makes you feel like you're exactly who you're meant to be, then don't let fear stop you. Don't let the opinions of small-minded wolves make you doubt your worth. We sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged one by one, painting constellations across the darkness. I thought about my mother, about the choice she'd made, and the life she'd built despite the cost. I thought about the girl I'd been, and the woman I was becoming. The pack needs support, I said finally. Resources, attention, respect. If I do this, if I stay with Dominic, I'll make sure Pinewood gets what it needs. We'll manage regardless, but I could hear the relief in his voice. Just promise me you're not doing this for us. Promise me you're choosing him because he's what you want. I promise. And it was true. Whatever political advantages might come from this, whatever doors might open or close, the core truth was simple. I wanted Dominic. Wanted his intensity and his vulnerability, his strength and his fear. Wanted to build something with him that neither of us could have created alone. I stayed the night in my old room, surrounded by books and memories and the ghosts of who I used to be. But when morning came, I was ready. Ready to leave this place that had shaped me. Ready to step into a future that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. My father stood on the porch as I prepared to leave, and I saw tears in his eyes for the first time since my mother's funeral. Make me proud, Celia. I will. I hugged him fiercely. I love you, Papa. I love you too. Now go. Your king is probably pacing holes in the palace floors waiting for you. The image made me laugh, and I carried that lightness with me as the carriage rolled away from Pinewood. I watched my father's figure grow smaller in the distance, watched the only home I'd ever known disappear behind the trees, and felt no regret. Only anticipation, because I was going home, just a different one. The palace came into view as the sun began its descent, all stone and strength and permanence. But I barely had time to appreciate it before the carriage door flew open, and Dominic was there, pulling me out and into his arms with a desperation that spoke of hours spent worrying. You came back. He breathed against my hair. I promised I would. I pulled back just enough to see his face, to catalog the relief and joy and love that transformed his harsh features into something heartbreakingly beautiful. And I always keep my promises. Stay with me. His hands framed my face, thumb brushing away a tear I hadn't realized had fallen. Not for 2 weeks or 2 months, but forever. Be my queen, Celia. Stand beside me and fight with me, and build something neither of us could create alone. I thought about my mother's courage, about my father's gentle wisdom, about the girl who'd stood against a wall trying to disappear, and the woman who'd learned to hold her ground. I thought about council meetings and political enemies and the 1,000 challenges that would come. And beneath it all, I thought about amber eyes and cedar scent, and a connection that had rewritten everything I thought I knew about myself. Yes, I said, and watched his world, our world, reshape itself around that single word. Yes, I'll be your queen. The kiss that followed tasted like promises kept and futures claimed, and love that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with souls that recognized each other across impossible distances. And somewhere in the palace, I knew Brennan and others like him were probably plotting their opposition. Clear his throat, but let them come. I'd spent my whole life being underestimated, dismissed, overlooked. It was time to show them what happened when the invisible girl finally stepped into the light. The announcement came 3 days later, delivered with all the ceremony and formality that such declarations demanded. I stood beside Dominic on the grand balcony overlooking the main courtyard, watching as hundreds of wolves gathered below. The sun blazed overhead, making the assembled crowd shimmer like a living thing, all upturned faces and curious eyes, waiting to hear what their king had to say. Dominic's hand found mine, his grip firm and steadying. Ready. No, I admitted, but let's do it anyway. His smile was quick, private, meant only for me. Then his expression shifted, became the mask of authority he wore so well, and he stepped forward to address his people. For 10 years, I have led you alone. His voice carried across the courtyard, amplified by the natural acoustics of the space. I have made decisions, forged alliances, and protected our territories without a partner at my side. Many of you have questioned this choice. Many have wondered when I would take a queen. The crowd stirred, whispers rippling through the assembly like wind through wheat. I waited because I refused to choose a political alliance over genuine connection. I waited because I believed that the wolf who stood beside me should do so out of love, not ambition. He turned to me, and the tenderness in his gaze made my breath catch. I waited for her. He drew me forward, and suddenly I was visible to everyone. Hundreds of eyes fixing on me with curiosity, skepticism, calculation. My wolf pressed close to the surface, caught between the urge to submit under so much attention and the strange, fierce pride that came from standing beside Dominic. Celia Thorne of Pinewood Pack will be my queen, Dominic announced, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. She is wise and courageous, compassionate and strong. She has challenged me, supported me, and shown me what true partnership looks like. Any who doubt her worth will answer to me. The last sentence carried an edge of warning that made several wolves in the crowd shift uncomfortably, but then something unexpected happened. From somewhere in the middle of the assembly, a wolf let out a howl of approval. Then another, and another. Within moments, the courtyard was filled with the sound, a chorus of acceptance that resonated in my bones and brought tears to my eyes. Not everyone joined in. I could see pockets of silence, wolves whose expressions ranged from disapproving to openly hostile. Brennan stood among them, his face a careful mask that couldn't quite hide his displeasure, but they were the minority, drowned out by the overwhelming wave of support from wolves who apparently cared more about their king's happiness than political maneuvering. Dominic pulled me close, pressed a kiss to my temple that sent the crowd into fresh howls of approval. "Welcome home, my queen," he murmured against my skin. The weeks that followed were a baptism by fire. I threw myself into learning everything I could about pack politics, territorial management, and the intricate web of relationships that held the kingdom together. Dominic was patient but demanding, pushed me to think critically, to question assumptions, to develop my own perspective rather than simply echoing his. The council meetings became my battlefield. Brennan continued his subtle campaign of undermining, questioning my recommendations, pointing out my inexperience, suggesting that perhaps the queen's time would be better spent on more appropriate pursuits. But I'd learned to fight back with facts and logic, to build alliances with other counselors who valued substance over tradition. "The Morrison border dispute," I said during one particularly contentious meeting, spreading maps across the table. "You've been approaching it as a territorial issue, but the real problem is resource scarcity. The river that runs through the disputed zone has been diverting further south each year due to erosion upstream. Neither pack is actually arguing about land. They're arguing about water access." Counselor Davies, an older wolf who'd initially been skeptical of me, leaned forward to study the maps. "If that's true, then the solution isn't redrawing borders. It's addressing the erosion." "Exactly." I pointed to several marked locations. "If we invest in stabilization efforts here, and here, the river will return to its natural course. Both packs get adequate water and we avoid a conflict that could have escalated into violence." Dominic's smile was subtle, but I felt his pride like warmth against my skin. "Brilliant. Davies, coordinate with Morrison and Clearwater. Let's get this resolved before winter." Brennan's expression was sour, but even he couldn't argue with the logic. Small victory, but I'd learned to savor them. Not all challenges came from the council. 3 months after the announcement, we hosted a gathering of neighboring packs, a diplomatic event meant to strengthen alliances and showcase unity. I'd spent weeks preparing, working with event coordinators to create an atmosphere that balanced formality with warmth. The evening was proceeding smoothly until Lena Frost arrived. She was everything I wasn't, tall and elegant with dark hair that fell in perfect waves and eyes like chips of ice. She'd been considered the frontrunner for queen before I appeared, and her displeasure at being displaced was written in every line of her body. "Your Majesty," she greeted Dominic with a smile that was all teeth. "How lovely to see you again, it's been far too long." "Lena," Dominic's tone was polite but cool. "May I present my queen, Celia?" Those ice-chip eyes fixed on me, assessing and dismissive in the same glance. "Of course. The famous Celia Thorne, I've heard so much about you." "All good things, I hope?" "Oh, certainly. Though I must admit, I was surprised by your background. Pinewood is such a small pack. I wouldn't have thought the Alpha King would choose someone so inexperienced." The insult was delivered with such sweetness that it took a moment to register. Around us, conversation had quieted, wolves tuning in to what was clearly becoming a confrontation. "Experience comes in many forms," I replied, keeping my voice level. "I may not have grown up in court politics, but I understand what it means to fight for survival, to make difficult choices with limited resources, to value substance over appearance. Those lessons serve me well here." "How quaint." Lena's smile sharpened, though I wonder if you truly understand what you've taken on. Being queen isn't just about standing beside the king and looking pretty. It requires knowledge, connections, the respect of the packs, all things that take years, sometimes generations, to build. "You're right," I agreed and watched surprise flicker across her face. "It does require those things. It also requires the ability to learn, to adapt, and to put the needs of the kingdom above personal ambition. I may have a lot to learn, but at least I'm here because the king chose me, not because I schemed and positioned myself hoping to be chosen." The barb hit home. Lena's expression turned venomous. "You little Lena." Dominic's voice cut across whatever insult she'd been about to deliver, cold enough to frost the air between us. "I think you've said enough. In fact, I think perhaps the Frost Pack's invitation to future gatherings should be reconsidered. We have no room for wolves who show such disrespect to their queen." The threat was unmistakable. Lena paled, realizing she'd pushed too far. "Your Majesty, I apologize. I meant no disrespect. Yet, you gave it freely." He shifted, positioning himself slightly in front of me in a gesture of protection that was both possessive and tender. "My queen's background is none of your concern. Her worthiness was determined the moment I chose her. Any who question that are questioning me. Am I clear?" "Crystal, your Majesty." Lena's bow was stiff, humiliated. She retreated quickly, and I watched her go with a mixture of triumph and exhaustion. "I could have handled that," I murmured to Dominic once we had a moment of relative privacy. "I know you could have." His hand found the small of my back, steadying and warm. "But you don't have to handle everything alone. That's what partnership means. We fight for each other." The words settled something restless in my chest. I'd spent so long proving myself, demonstrating that I deserved to be here, that I'd almost forgot I wasn't supposed to do it alone. 6 months into my reign as queen, winter arrived with brutal efficiency. Snow buried the palace grounds, and the temperature dropped until even wolves with thick fur felt the bite of cold. It was during this season that the real test came. Reports arrived of strange disappearances in the Eastern Territories, wolves vanishing without trace, their scent simply ending. No signs of violence, no bodies, nothing but empty spaces where pack members used to be. Fear spread like wildfire, and suddenly every small pack on the border was demanding protection, resources, clears, throat answers we didn't have. The council was in chaos. Theories ranged from rogue wolves to some kind of sickness to supernatural intervention. Brennan, predictably, suggested pulling resources back to the core territories and leaving the border packs to fend for themselves. "That would be signing their death warrants," I said, my voice cutting through the arguing. "These are our people, our responsibility." "With respect, your Majesty, we have limited resources," Brennan countered. "Spreading ourselves too thin could leave us all vulnerable." "Then we need to be smarter." I stood, moving to the map that dominated one wall. "The disappearances follow a pattern. Look, they start here in the deepest part of the mountain passes. They move south, targeting isolated homesteads first, then gradually moving toward larger settlements." Davies leaned in to study the pattern I'd marked. "You're right, it's methodical, which means it's not random wolves or sickness." I traced the likely path with my finger. "Something is hunting us. Something intelligent enough to plan, to avoid detection, to target the most vulnerable first." "You're suggesting we're dealing with an organized threat," Dominic said, his expression grave. "I'm suggesting we need to stop reacting and start anticipating." I turned to face the council. "We know where the pattern leads. We can set a trap." fortify the next likely target, position our strongest fighters, and finally get answers about what we're facing. Brennan opened his mouth to object, but Dominic held up a hand. The Queen's strategy is sound. Davies, coordinate with the border packs. Brennan, organize our best trackers and fighters. I want this handled before more wolves disappear. The operation took 2 weeks to organize. I insisted on being part of the response team, despite Dominic's initial resistance. We argued about it for hours, his fear for my safety warring with his respect for my judgment. I need to be there, I finally said, exhausted from fighting. Not because I'm trying to prove anything, but because these are my people too. If I'm going to be their queen, I can't leave from safety while they face danger. If something happens to you, then you'll make sure whoever did it regrets it for the rest of their very short life. I cupped his face, forcing him to meet my eyes. I know you're scared. I'm scared too, but fear can't be what guides us. Trust me to be smart, to be careful, to come back to you. He held me close that night, and I memorized the feel of his arms around me. The steady beat of his heart, the cedar and storm scent that had become home. The trap was sprung on a night when the moon hung full and bright, turning the snow into a field of diamonds. We waited in silence, positioned around a small settlement that matched the pattern perfectly. Hours passed with nothing but wind and cold and the tension of anticipation. Then they came, not wolves, not anything natural. Creatures that moved like shadows given form, with eyes that glowed sickly green and movements that defied physics. They flowed toward the settlement like water, silent and deadly, clearly expecting easy prey. Instead, they found us. The battle was brief but brutal. These things, wraiths someone called them later, were strong but vulnerable to coordinated attacks. We moved as a unit. The months of training and trust paying off as we drove them back, captured several, eliminated the rest. In the aftermath, as dawn painted the sky pink and gold, I stood among my people, blood spattered and exhausted but victorious. Dominic found me there, pulled me into his arms with a desperation that spoke of hours spent fearing the worst. "Don't ever do that to me again," he growled against my hair. No promises. But I held him just as tightly, grateful to be alive, to be held, to have found this impossible love that had reshaped everything. Spring came eventually, as it always does. The captured wraiths provided information about a faction that had been trying to weaken the kingdom from the edges inward, a plot that had failed because we'd caught it early, because we'd worked together, because I'd refused to let fear dictate strategy. The council's respect for me shifted after that night. Even Brennan, though he'd never be warm, treated me with grudging acknowledgement of my capabilities. I'd proven myself not through birthright or political maneuvering, but through courage and competence. More importantly, I'd proven it to myself. 1 year after that first gathering, Dominic and I stood once again on the balcony overlooking the courtyard. But this time, instead of announcing our engagement, we were celebrating our anniversary. The crowd below was larger, more diverse. Wolves from territories that had been strangers now stood together as allies. "Do you ever regret it?" Dominic asked quietly, his arm around my waist. "Giving up your quiet life for all this chaos?" I thought about Pinewood, about the girl I'd been who'd wanted nothing more than to be invisible. I thought about the battles fought and won, the enemies made and allies forged, the 1,000 ways I'd been tested and transformed. I thought about my father's letter that morning, full of pride and love and news that Pinewood was thriving with the support and resources we'd provided. "Not for a single moment," I said, and meant it with every fiber of my being. "This is exactly where I'm meant to be." He kissed me then, soft and sweet and full of promise. And the crowd below howled their approval, the sound carrying across the territories like a song of unity and hope. I'd come here as nobody from nowhere, expecting nothing. I'd found love and purpose and a strength I'd never known I possessed. I'd become a queen not through birthright, but through choice. Both his choice and mine. And as the sun set over our kingdom painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, I knew with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning. There would be more challenges, more enemies, more moments of fear and doubt, but there would also be love and partnership, and the knowledge that I'd found where I belonged. Not in spite of who I was, but because of it. The invisible girl had stepped into the light, and she was never going back into the shadows again.